In every major esports tournament, the goal of each successive tournament year on year is to build your audience. And in 2022 to 2023, the World Series of Warzone absolutely skyrocketed, outperforming every single Call of Duty League event for that year, despite having less funding and less planning. So you would assume that going into 2024, the goal would be the same. The World Series of Warzone could continue to drive forward and create growth and viewership for everyone. But for Activision, unfortunately, that wasn't the case. And this is the story of how a $1 million tournament ended up having a complete collapse in viewership and was painfully mismanaged from start to finish. When $1 million are on the line and people are investing hours upon hours of their time into competing, you would assume that these processes would be smooth and effective. But in the case of the World Series of Warzone, nearly every stage of the tournament has had critical failures that completely undermine competitors. Now, I don't normally start these videos with disclosures or caveats, but I do feel like this one is really necessary, because it isn't down to the staff who worked on the World Series of Warzone. The casters were phenomenal, the production teams were clearly doing their best, and generally speaking, organization was probably as good as it could be. But the reality is, from a managerial level and from a top-down level, the World Series of Warzone was painfully slapped together, extremely last minute, and created tons of problems both for viewers and for competitors. And it shouldn't really be a surprise. Activision very recently laid off its entire esports division, who were in charge of having a super successful 2023 World Series of Warzone, and none of them were there for 2024. So whilst we don't actually know who really put everything together for World Series of Warzone in 2024, the last-minute nature of it suggests that we were lucky there was even one hosted at all. But before we even talk about the two-day championship and the global finals that have just gone, we need to talk about everything that's led up to this point. How the World Series of Warzone went from a structured event in 2023 with qualification series to an event that seemed entirely slapped together and extremely last-minute. When we rewind to the open qualification and World Series of Warzone officially being announced for 2024 way back in the summer, they actually only announced it with a week's notice for all competitors, meaning that people who had family vacations, holidays, or plans had to completely cancel or change them with a week's notice to go. On top of that, it was also hosted during a very popular bank holiday weekend in the United Kingdom, which meant that a lot of UK and even some European competitors had plans completely cancelled. And then on top of that, the week's notice meant that esports organizations had absolutely zero time to do any groundwork or communication to make sure that they could participate with certain teams going into the World Series of Warzone. Teams like Cloud9, Falcons from Saudi Arabia, FaZe, and others did eventually make it to the final in the World Series of Warzone, but none of them were there from the beginning because they were never given that opportunity to salary people or given contracts or have those conversations from day one because there was only a week's amount of time. Then the qualification process swung round. The qualification process for the World Series of Warzone was probably the most transparent to date, and I really do respect that, and it was a good approach. But cheaters were rife in the qualification process, very infamously knocking out Team Fnatic, an actual esports organization who had probably invested time, money, and salary into its players in order to participate in this tournament. A group of cheaters who are known to the community, vetted incorrectly, and allowed to play, ended up knocking out Fnatic and making it sure that they wouldn't make the global finals. The open qualification process simply meant that anybody could get through, and some people even had instances of live streaming their gameplay privately to individuals at Call of Duty as opposed to leaving them public. And if you want to make sure that esports organizations are never going to touch your competitive esport ever again, it's allowing random cheaters from completely unknown backgrounds to completely compromise the integrity of the qualification process. And once the teams had made it through a very structured qualification process, which included 2 phases of qualification and a last chance qualification process, they were left in the dark. No venue was announced for the World Series of Warzone until a month before the actual event would take place, meaning that expansion regions, namely teams from regions around the world that are a little bit more obscure or don't have the same limelight that esports teams in Europe and North America do, had basically little to no time in order to apply for the visa process to make it to this tournament, meaning that multiple high-talented players, including a high-ranked player from Saudi Arabia and an Nexian, one of the best players going generally in the scene right now, could not make it to the tournament. The decision was also made that this tournament would be hosted in the United States, which has a very challenging visa process, especially for things like esports events and tournaments that has been well documented in the past for a number of different tournaments, despite the fact that in the year before, hosting in London was dramatically easier and led to less of these incidents. I have no doubt in my mind that the World Series of Warzone was in fact meant to be in Europe or possibly even in London again. But I am 100% confident, and I will say this on a whim, that this is definitely the case, that it was supposed to be there again, but because of the organizational flaws that I've spoken about so far and the ones I will speak about, they didn't book it in time. There is no reason or beneficial reason for any esports organizer or event organizer for that matter to wait for so long to disclose the location of something happening. The reality is that they didn't have a location because they hadn't planned it accordingly. So hosting in the United States in Vegas came with some serious problems. It meant that some players couldn't actually attend the event, and on top of that, it being in the West Coast meant that the actual starting hours would neglect viewership in Europe. And to add more insult to injury, for those people who actually wanted to attend the World Series of Warzone, it was taking place on the same weekend in the same location as the UFC, meaning that it was going to be absolutely constricted. You have a tournament in the West Coast, in Las Vegas, on a busy weekend where flights and hotels have already had their prices jacked up, announced a month to go so people can't get their visas, can't book their hotels in advance, and on top of that, the actual time slot is completely incompatible with Europe and most places in the rest of the world. Which also meant that it clashed not only with NFL kickoff on Sunday, but the Barclays Premier League in the United Kingdom, and college football on the Saturday. Meaning that this esports event not only was being damaged by in-person busyness reducing the number of people who could probably afford to even go to it, but was also being thrown under the bus by the actual scheduling in relation to other things going on in the world. Even if you look aside from things like college football, NFL, and the Barclays Premier League having same starting hours to what is hopefully your biggest esports tournament of the year, and you assume that the audiences are different, you're still hosting it in the West Coast of the United States. To give you context to this, the World Series of Warzone final started at 8 PM in the United Kingdom and 9 PM in Central Europe, and finished at around about 4 o'clock in the morning for the United Kingdom and 5 AM for Central Europe, meaning it was entirely unwatchable for a number of people. So there was a number of contextual reasons as to why Vegas made absolutely zero sense to host this tournament, both in terms of time zones, busyness, other events happening in the same location, and just generally being extremely difficult for the actual competitors who you have promised expansion regions for to even make it to this tournament. Now granted, not that many people did get their visas denied, but this is clearly something that should have been thought of months in advance, especially for people who have sunk hundreds of hours into the competing process so far. And on top of all of this stuff that I've mentioned in regards to Vegas, in terms of the qualification build-up, the lack of timing, the lack of preparation, and all these things that have made this tournament substantially more difficult, it's also worth mentioning that this was placed after Call of Duty Next, and after the Black Ops 6 beta. So in the marketing and hype cycle for Call of Duty, nobody even knew that the World Series was taking place, and in fact, I had a number of people on my timeline and in my own Discord astonished that the World Series was even being hosted on that weekend because they just hadn't heard about it. Having the World Series of Warzone after Call of Duty Next, once the focus is already on your next iteration of Warzone, feels like a major mistake, and it's something that very clearly did affect this year's tournament. So let's talk about the actual 2-day championship itself. I've mentioned all of the contextual reasons as to why up until the actual tournament itself and the final 2 days, everything was already in a challenging spot and things were already difficult for competitors, orgs, and people generally planning to visit and attend this event or even watch it online depending on what part of the world you were in. And I do want to caveat and again disclaimer this entire segment by saying that the casting team for this were utterly phenomenal, really well planned, and did great research to really keep this production flowing. And I do want to caveat it by saying that these events are not easy to do, especially with 120 players, especially when you fire your entire esports division. And the actual second day of the event was a much better viewer experience for pretty much everybody and went off far more smoothly. The first day was absolutely hideously covered with problems. We're going to talk about this from both a viewer perspective and a competitor perspective. For viewers, the first day of the World Series of Warzone was a 7 to 8 hour affair, averaging just one game every single hour. And all of this stems from the fact that private matches in Call of Duty Warzone are deeply neglected by Activision. In fact, watching them spend thousands upon thousands, millions of dollars even, both in terms of this prize pool and other tournaments that they've hosted throughout the year, on a private match system that doesn't actually work, is single-handedly one of the craziest things you'll see in any modern AAA shooter. The private match system for Warzone has not worked for nearly 2 to 3 years now. There are crashes intermediately if you end up being in the lobby for too long. Most people tend to crash at least probably 2 to 3 times a customs. Dev errors are far more common, meaning that people actually crash in the entire custom setup itself, and pretty much the entire thing is just a nightmare to run. There are a lot of ways that this affects competitors, but from a viewer perspective, it also means that we're talking about potentially an 8-hour day for just day 1 of a 2-day tournament, when matches are only half an hour long. 6 matches and 1 solo YOLO were played on day 1, which should amount to, in reality, something closer to 3.5 hours to 4 hours total runtime once you factor in commentary and interviews. But we saw an event that nearly took double that on day 1, let alone for the people who were watching in the venue and had to wait around for an hour or 2 per game. We had competitors playing chess in between rounds, we had competitors watching the UFC because they were waiting that long, and the simple fact of the matter is, having 6 games, 7 if you include the solo YOLO, in the space of 8 hours is entirely unacceptable for a viewer's perspective. The second day again was infinitely better and ran far more smoothly, but that also came at the compromise of some general player integrity. We'll touch on that a little bit more later. But for those people who were actually at the event, I had a couple DMs from a few people who were just saying that the entire thing felt very frustrating. Sitting there for a number of hours waiting for games to start, the fact that prices to even fly to Vegas and book hotels was already crazily inflated because of the UFC, and even though the venue itself was actually pretty decent, it just meant that all of these compounding effects made it a nightmare for people attending the event itself to enjoy what they were watching. And then on top of that, if you were somebody who watched it in Europe, or even the East Coast of the United States arguably to some extent, it was such a long event that most of us ended up going to bed, which is definitely a contribution as to why viewership has completely collapsed. Neglecting an entire European audience to host an event on the West Coast that finished at 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock in the morning is just a huge oversight. So let's talk about it from a competitor's perspective, and I'm talking about this from somebody who has actually played at the global finals of World Series of Warzone in 2023. Now granted, we didn't finish anywhere near where we wanted to, and I'm definitely more of a content creator than a competitive player, but the experience in 2023 was phenomenal. There was very little downtime between maps, things felt very well organized, things felt like I always had someone to talk to whenever something went wrong, but in the case of 2024, it seemed like that didn't seem to happen at all. Now, some of these things were addressed and dealt with by the production teams on the ground, but some of them shouldn't have even been problems in the first place. One of the biggest malfunctions of the day was that one of the main competitors, Diaz Biffle, who ended up being part of the Falcons team that won the tournament, was on worse hardware than his fellow competitors. Now, in the esports world of things, it's an absolute necessity that everybody is using the same PCs, the same monitors, pretty much as much of the same equipment as humanly possible to create a level playing field. We're talking about competitive scenarios where the difference between you winning and losing $100,000 and absolutely nothing is whether or not you win or lose a gunfight. And whether or not you win or lose a gunfight is how much your reaction time was locked in. Did you have extra frames than your opponent that gave you faster response times that let you react faster? Level playing fields are a necessity. Biffle had a 7600 XT in his PC, his competitors had 7900 XTs in their system, and it's likely that other parts of his hardware was also misconfigured. This meant that he was on substantially lower frame rates. We're talking more than 100 FPS less than some of his fellow opponents. This was resolved, but only after about 3 or 4 matches into the tournament, which also led to another substantial delay. And each time something like this goes wrong and isn't accounted for properly, delays do occur. And a lot of this, except for the hardware problem that I've just mentioned, is that this vaguely pretty much all stems from the fact that Call of Duty have never cared about private matches, never supported it properly, never given it updates, and never looked after it. And because of that, it's just meant we've had a huge collapse in reliability. For those of you who have never played a customs tournament before, if you sit in a custom lobby that doesn't start after about 3 to 4 minutes, for whatever reason, private matches will just end up making people's systems crash. That is something that has happened for the last 2 years now. If you don't start something within 4 to 5 minutes, it's pretty much game over. You have to reset the entire lobby and make 120 players rejoin again. So getting all of those players in position to kick off the lobby in its own sense is already a difficult task, and when something goes wrong, they're forced into resets. And if you think this isn't a big issue, it is, because top teams, including Aiden's team who finished very high on the leaderboard and in the money, had multiple games chalked by dev errors and their own teammates crashing out of the tournament. And I cannot overemphasize how much of a disadvantage it is to go from being in a 3v3 gunfight to being in a 2v3 because you lost a teammate. It entirely changes the entire outcome of your game in the World Series of Warzone. If you don't have a full strength team, you are not winning that tournament. It's just, that's how it is. That is how comp works, how it plays for Warzone. If you are at any kind of disadvantage, you get punished for it instantly. So having multiple games where multiple competitors aren't even in their full 3-man teams because of dev errors is also hugely unacceptable. Bearing in mind, most of these competitors have not made an ounce of earnings in order to get to this process. The World Series of Warzone gave you no cash if you finished top in the qualifications. You only got cash from making it to the final. There was also inconsistency around whether or not a game was reset or not. Now granted, I think they'd heard the feedback that on day 1 things took too long to complete. So on day 2, they were a bit more heavy-handed. The Falcons team that I previously mentioned ended up having a restart in one of the matches on the second day. And they got a restart because something had gone wrong with one of their systems, or someone had crashed, which warranted restarting and getting everybody to load up again. But for 3 other competitors, that wasn't the case. Clavson, GUI, and FLS were in the top 5 at 5th place, when in the second day of the tournament, they had audio issues going into the game and had alerted the people on the ground that they had issues that prevented them playing properly. But for whatever reason, they weren't given a restart, but the Falcons were. I'm not going to assume or impose that there's some sort of bias or favorability to larger teams with larger followings. I'm not going to say that it's because they were focusing on those teams more than others. I'm simply going to say that from a competitive standpoint, if something's wrong for one person, it should be wrong for everybody and it should be reset. I mean, we shouldn't even be talking about technical issues, dev errors, crashing and resetting anyway, but private matches are not a priority for Call of Duty, despite spending millions of dollars on tournaments. And then on the flip side of things, outside of the competitor realm, there were stream audio issues at the beginning of the production, which meant huge static and people not watching. The streams actually crashed for about 10 minutes straight at one point and actually had some lagging on day 1. And again, all of this was solved on day 2 and did generally head in the right direction. But for some viewers, it just was a total turn-off from them watching the tournament. And all of these reasons, all of the things I've mentioned, both in terms of this tournament being difficult for viewers, difficult for competitors and everyone in between, is exactly why Call of Duty's World Series of Warzone went from exponential growth to a total viewership collapse in 2024. We're talking about a tournament that had to change someone's PC mid-game. We're talking about a tournament where cheaters ended up knocking out Fnatic, one of the largest esports organizations in human history. We're talking about the fact that it was hosted on the same weekend as a UFC event, which drove up prices to eye-watering levels for people who actually wanted to attend. A tournament that announced expansion regions so that players from different backgrounds could participate in the tournament, but then hosted the event in Vegas so that they couldn't get visas. A tournament that didn't even announce the venue for where it was taking place until a month before it was going to happen. The simple harsh reality is that Call of Duty is never going to be esports ready for Warzone, even though it could be. Warzone genuinely could be up there competing with Apex and ALGS and also competing with things like PUBG in terms of viewership, in terms of potential, and in terms of driving fans and audiences. But for whatever reason, they just don't care about it. They don't want to commit to it, they don't want to give time to it, and all they end up doing is throwing silly amounts of cash towards tournaments without actually supporting how those tournaments take place. This entire year, for the last year or so, has been a concentrated effort by creators, other people who are influential in the space, casters, and other people to bring Warzone comp forward, provide more tournaments, and make more things happen. But from a Call of Duty standpoint, they've done nothing to support it beyond throwing cash at it. They haven't supported private matches, they haven't allowed private matches to thrive, flourish, or even work in any way, shape, or... I mean, they don't even work. I mean, I'm not even here talking about balancing, like being able to ban certain items from private matches. I'm talking about the fact that from a foundational level, they still don't actually work at all. And this is why World Series of Warzone might not happen in 2025, or it just might not happen at all. Now, I think they probably will end up doing it just as a marketing tool for Verdansk, but the reality is that comp won't survive due to how much Call of Duty neglects its custom systems. They don't spend any development time on it, they don't fix the things that need fixing, and they don't listen to their comp community about how they can improve that experience. There is also no schedule for the year as well. There's no guarantee that tournaments are going to happen, and when they do, they tend to be announced last minute on Twitter with about 10 minutes head start notice, and it means that esports organizations are not invested, and because of the CDL franchising, they're less likely to get invested, because Warzone often plays second fiddle to the CDL, despite clearly having the opportunity to have more viewership. I'm going to close out by saying that I feel as though World Series of Warzone in 2025 is something that could be super successful. If they focus on fixing private matches, if they focus on providing the tools for people to host their own tournaments and make things happen at an extremely good level, then they will. But continuing to funnel money into a tournament system that's just fundamentally not working properly, and then provide a tournament which seems to have been put together in the space of less than a month, just isn't right. It isn't fair to competitors, it isn't fair to viewers, and I guess my general message to Activision is either do it properly or don't do it at all. Again, I want to finish this video on a positive note. I have buckets of respect for the teams who casted this, buckets of respect for the teams who had to pull all of this together. I have no doubt in my mind that it has been difficult, especially considering more layoffs have occurred even since the original esports team was laid off themselves. I have no doubt in my mind that this has been extremely difficult. I have no doubt in my mind that the people who were asked to put this event together probably had very little time, very limited budgets, and just weren't given a huge amount of help. But from a leadership level, from a structural level, at the very top of things for Call of Duty, it's put up or shut up time. It's either do it properly, invest the time in it, get private matches working, give these tournaments the space they need to grow and flourish, and let esports orgs get involved. And if we're not going to do that, and we're going to have the same busted private match system in 2025, then don't do it at all, because it's not fair on the competitors who are spending hundreds of hours competing for these tournaments and throwing away social life opportunities and more to make things happen and be successful when they're being let down by dev error crashes in the actual day of the tournament. That's all, folks. If you enjoyed this video, drop a like. Please leave constructive comments down below. I won't really tolerate anybody being nasty or mean towards people who have tried to make this event take place, but I just felt it needed to be said. This tournament wasn't good enough, it needs to be better, and I want to hear your thoughts and feelings from a viewership perspective down below. As always, folks, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.